So I guess I'm going to try and just talk through a few parts of the PhD, not really trying to talk about the content of the PhD, but just, I guess, the way I went through the process of doing the PhD, and then the way parts of that were presented, how I tried to use the PRS symposium, how it was presented at the end, and how it was diagrammed. So this is a diagram, and this is, I guess, one of the more important tools I used throughout the process of the PhD. And this was trying to tie together a series of projects, ideas, I guess lineages of work or concepts, and try to sort of intertwine those things and explain how it is that I got to where I got to, why the work is the way that it is. And so it's not a very precise diagram. Like, it's not a diagram that makes precise relationships between things. It's much more of a way of having a canvas where I sort of placed everything and then started to try and think about the relationship between them. And so on the left-hand side, it's there's a series of things that have happened in the past that informed what I did, and then on the right-hand side, it sort of moves across to the projects. I'll go back to that and explain that in more detail in a minute. This is another diagram, and this is trying to explain the projects. So I'm an architect. These are all of these little boxes here represent, I guess, building design projects, and that traces back to when I was completing my major project at RMIT back here, through work that I did when I was doing a master's at Columbia. It's that lump there. There's some of the early work of my practice up the top. That's with Kukuja. And then this last kind of bracket, this last couple of years, from about here to here, they're projects I did during the PhD. Now, what I was trying to do, and the PhD that I did is quite heavily interested in design process, and it was methodologically based in that way. And so what I'm trying to do in this diagram is draw out a series of what I describe as strategies. They're really design processes or important strategies in that can be drawn out of the work that really generated the work. Some of those draw right back to, one of those draws right back to the work I was doing when I was a student here at RMIT. And so there's about 8 of those. And that became one way in which I described the work that I was doing. Another way of doing this was looking at the way I could then start to reconnect those. So you can see that particularly once I started the PhD, some of these quite disparate lines were starting to bundle in different ways, and that was quite conscious. And from the very first PRS, back when it was called a GRC, I had some of those. Not all of them were worked out, but some of them were worked out. And I started to propose how in the future GRCs or PRSs, I would start to join those things together, or which ones were logical to overlap, and how they might relate. And so I guess a lot of this was trying to explain the process in which through PRSs were, I guess we're going back and looking at the work that we've designed, obviously having feedback on that, and trying to understand how that's positioned, and then trying to feed that back into new projects. And so this was trying to consciously understand what are the strategies that get understood and then fed back in. Okay. So back to this diagram. This became a diagram that I developed at the beginning of the PhD in some form, and then just kept on getting redeveloped. And it became not only a useful tool for me to try and understand what I was doing, but also try and explain what I was doing. And so what I would do is, and I'll run through this a little bit, it's a diagram which I just constantly zoomed into and out of. So on the one hand, I would try and describe a lot of the ideas that led to the work that I was doing, and a lot of those ideas came through complexity theory, self-organization and emergence. It was heavily influenced by swarm intelligence and Craig Reynolds' early Boyd's algorithms, looking at self-organization in flocks and schools. A diagram of those algorithms. So on the one hand, I was looking at that. On the other hand, I would go through and zoom in and look at different descriptions of the methodologies, I'd often try and describe this by talking about a particular project and going into some detail on that project, and then pulling out and talking about more generalized things. So in this case, it was talking about the nature of the underlying algorithms or the behaviors within those algorithms, the way those behaviors would negotiate, the way they'd operate in geometry, and then the ways that they'd relate to projects. So this was something where in each PRS, I would try to give a very brief overview for the first, let's say, 5 minutes of the presentation and try and explain very quickly what the whole PhD was about. And then I would try and use each PRS to, I guess, tackle a certain part of what I thought the PhD was going to be. And originally I thought this was probably best done in terms of thinking about what the chapters of the PhD might be, and then trying to use each PRS to spend that 6 months working on developing what that chapter might be, and then, I guess, presenting it in a way and trying to get feedback on it. In the end, that didn't really work. It wasn't a very successful strategy because partly was probably due to, it's very hard to write those chapters until you get to the end. It's very hard to sort of know at the beginning what those chapters are going to be. So what I'd end up doing is just using the PRSs to present the work that I was going on with, like the projects. So I'd normally spend a quarter or a third of the PRS presenting the overall thing, then try and present the projects that I had done during that process. And it was a fairly, I actually found that during the PRS, or during the period of the PhD, I was perhaps more productive and produced more projects. So it wasn't something that ever was slowing I wasn't being slowed down by, I guess, the reflection. And if anything, it was accelerating the work that I was doing. Okay, so then that diagram also contains all of the projects over here. And the way I'd often talk about that is I'd look at a given idea. So fibrous assemblages, this is one of the 8 strategies that I originally put in that projects diagram. And then in this, I would then try and explain that through a series of diagrams that might explain the operation of that design strategy, and then a series of projects. All right, so that sort of stayed with me until the end of the PhD. I'm just going to jump back to what I was writing, and just a few notes on what I wrote. I guess this is the contents of the final document, and it was broken down into essays, so 4 essays, 8 strategies, a series of techniques, and then what I describe as key projects, and then sort of an introduction, conclusion to bracket that. It's listed in this way, but then it was sort of shuffled in such a way that it made adjacencies between certain things. So certain projects and techniques were adjacent within the book, so it wasn't in this order. I guess when I sat down to write, I guess a few things about the way I wrote the document. One way was trying to write papers during the process, during the PhD. So I wrote a number of papers that I published, and then one of those became almost an entire chapter, the chapter on volatility. Other bits of those then sort of found their way into other parts of the text at some point. That seemed like, for me, a fairly effective way of doing a lot of the writing. Another way I tried to write was consistently throughout the PhD, and I think that one thing that I heard at the beginning of when I was in this situation, was people kept saying they had wished they had written more during the PhD rather than trying to write it all at the end. And so I took that on board and tried that. But of course had a full-time position here. I tried to run a practice full-time, so then my PhD became my 3rd full-time job, and it was really hard to get the writing done. And so what I would do is I just set aside 3 evenings a week where I'd spend 4 hours each of those evenings. That's 12 hours writing a week. And I wrote quite a lot, but when I got to the end, none of that text made it through to the final document. And so I'm not sure whether it was a misguided attempt. And I think there's a few reasons for it. One is because I think it's a really bad idea, for me at least, to write in small chunks of time, like 4-hour blocks, and particularly in the evenings. I mean, it's not very effective. For me, it's not a very effective time to write. So on the one hand, maybe that was a complete waste, and maybe I could have spent that time doing something else. And that other thing, probably one of my regrets, is that I probably should have used the time earlier in the PhD to do more reading. and actually some of that came later in the PhD, which is, had its problems. But then at the same time, I think when I sat down to do the bulk of the writing, which was in the end, so I wrote I really wrote the whole PhD in the last 6 months, I guess, as perhaps a lot of people do. I think the writing came pretty easily, and I was, in fact, very productive during that period. And I think maybe it's because I had a first stab at writing a lot of it, and of course a lot of the ideas got worked through. So I don't think it was a complete waste. At the end, I realized that it was maybe productive because I knew at that point what I had to write. But when I actually sat down to do that writing, I fairly radically changed the framing of my PhD. So when I started the PhD, and in fact most of the way through the PhD, I thought I was writing a PhD about the architecture of swarm intelligence, so a kind of methodological inquiry. It's in some way that was something that was supposed to be generalized. So I was sort of trying to say this is a way of thinking about generative design, and it's a way that can be, I guess, adopted within architecture. And then as I started to write about the work, I realized that all of the generalizable things about it weren't actually really of interest to me, and I think that was a rhetoric that I'd often used to explain my work in the past, but in reality it wasn't really the key concern. And I realized that it was actually a lot of the more esoteric qualities of the buildings and the strange characteristics of them that I was really interested in. And so it was less about design process and the way something was designed, and I realized I was much more interested in the things themselves. And I think a lot of that came about through writing about the projects differently. So I'd been quite used to writing about my work in a really, that's partially an academic way, but I have this tendency that Pia would always criticize me for writing at a great distance from the work. And I think that had two problems. One, it made it very hard for people to really engage with the work because it was quite abstract. And I think the other problem is that it made it very hard for me to be honest about the work because I was sort of shrouding the work in this this cloud of discussion of methodology. And so in fact, something that I think Marcelo, I think you probably suggested to me, is to write about projects in first person. And so then as soon as I started writing about the projects in first person, one, it took on a very different tone, but it forced me to write about them in a different way. And I think that when I started doing that, I realized that there was a whole lot of things about the projects themselves which exceeded any description of the ideas behind them, which were important. And that sort of that made me reframe what I was doing and why I was doing it. So so I guess in this structure, in the strategies I was talking about methodology, but when I got to the projects, I was really just trying to talk about the qualities and characteristics of the projects themselves. I wasn't trying to talk about the ideas behind them or the process of coming to being. So here's just a few screen grabs out of the document. So there were chapters which were trying to put it into a larger context. There were ones that were talking about, I guess, some of the ideas behind the work. There were some which were talking about particular problems. This is the essay on volatility. There were small spreads which were dealing with very technical aspects. So this was there was a series of these which were dealing with trying to diagram a technical part of an algorithm, explain what it is and how it works. There were other parts which were just about the projects. This is one of those, and this is one of the strategies. The last essay was an essay that was, I guess one of the early essays was trying to describe the context in which I started working on this multi-agent swarm intelligence-based work, which was really, I guess, about 10 years ago. And then the essay at the end was trying to explain what had happened within those 10 years, and I also put it into context in terms of what my peers were doing. So I guess one of the emphasis of the PhD is to discuss the community of practice. And I was quite fortunate in this way that I guess I had tried to include that in the diagram, and maybe I'll just zoom out and have a look at that. So one part of this diagram and I guess one of the good things about the diagram in terms of presenting is because it's a little bit less linear than a PDF or something. It was quite good to be able to field questions and zoom in and out of. So I was trying to diagram the way, I guess, what the community of practice is for the work that I do. But then at the same time, there was an exhibition towards the end of my PhD in the last 6 months, I guess, at FRAC curated by Frederick Migeru, the Archilab show. And that was quite useful for me because what that was really doing is having other people write about what is the community of practice. And so this was an example where somebody was sort of saying, here's community of practice, and they were situating my work in it. And that was quite useful because then I could partly because I could cite it, but more importantly, it's something I could respond to and react against and say, well, actually, no, that's not the case. Like, you've lumped a whole lot of people in a fairly homogenous way, but really I'd make some much finer differentiations between the work and at some point say, there are people in this group who have really radically different ways of conceiving of the work. So that was a important way of working. I thought I might just, I don't know how long I've got to talk or how I'm going over time, but okay. I'll talk a little bit about the presentation then. This is some photos from the final presentation. And the way I tried to break that up was to have a panel here, and this panel was mostly explaining the design process. So there's a lot of the digital work that I was doing, a lot of the algorithmic work, and that consisted of a series of one fairly large digital screen, a sort of medium-sized one, and a series of small ones embedded in here. And they had algorithms running on them, and these sort of swarm algorithms that I've been working on. And above here, what I was trying to emphasize is specific images of the projects where they were trying to demonstrate what sort of effects or qualities they have. And I think this was sort of, a lot of the PhD became about the relationship between these two things. What's happening down here in terms of the generative design, and what's happening in terms of the end result of those things. So the way I presented it was, I talked to this diagram that I've been jumping back and forth to, and then when I get to a particular project, I'd sort of walk across and then have a more kind of traditional or typical slideshow where I'd step through in more detail about those projects. And then another part of the presentation was this table of bits of prototypes and a screen which was showing the robotics work I've been doing. This was very much an attempt to try and say, okay, on the top there's all these images of the types of characteristics, effects I'm trying to create. The black panel is all about process, and here is the sort of first attempt to try and get these things out of the computer and try and make them into real things, and how they cut with robots or form with robots, and how they cast and laminated, etc. And then it gave me a good excuse to engage with the panel by being able to pick up things and carry them over and show them and hand things to them. Maybe it's sort of a way of trying to get them, stop them falling asleep or something, get them responding to you in a kind of engaged way. So maybe just to kind of conclude, I think maybe one of the more important things for me in terms of the process of doing the PhD was realizing that once I was able to strip away all of the rhetoric around the projects and write about them in a really clear way, that was actually really the thing that made me reconsider the way I think about my practice, and that's had a kind of impact on the work that I've done since. But also helped me to reframe the PhD, and I think make it a kind of more interesting and more engaging and sort of more useful inquiry. So that's it.
Good afternoon. My PhD was pretty much a elaboration of a research-based practice and a reflective way of looking upon my work and what were the drivers of the architecture, what were the drivers of the practice, and how I could understand the notion of what the practice was. Upon further observation, I realized that it wasn't one practice, it was several practices. And as time evolved, we uncovered that the best way for us to understand what the research practice was to divide or subdivide the practice into areas of interest. One of which was we called architecture, one was the interest in the virtual, the third was the interest in objects, and the fourth was our association in education and institutions. So it was an interesting plan to, this was the first sketch that was produced, and it was sort of maps out the 4 diagrams of what we consider to be the practice. But underneath the first layer, there's several other layers, as what we call ghost layers. And these ghost layers are not necessarily related just to the time frame of your practice in terms of, say, in terms of our case, which is in its 3rd decade. The question was also, what is that practice? And in many ways, the practice was a form of a lab. It was a way of understanding new ways of making, new ways of thinking, but also it came through a sense of discovery that the forms that emerged really were connected upon conversations, they were connected upon new techniques. It was also a point in time where there was a transfer from analog to digital, and I think that was a very, very influential point in time, because I guess one foot of my practice was still in the analog, and the other was exploring new ways to produce ideas and produce projects. So surrounding yourself with very young people at the time, mainly from RMIT University, was a way for us to have conversations and also test these ideas in a very pedagogical way. It wasn't, in a way, a practice that was dealing with questions of a linear process of producing architectural projects, but it was very much what we call a critical way of thinking about it as risk-taking. And the risk-taking was also connected back to materiality. It was connected back to how you produce things in a physical way, but also to sort of think what are the drivers of this thinking and how these things could actually evolve. So at the commencement of the PhD, I guess there was a confrontation with the work as a body, and how do you start to understand this body of work. And you can see on the left-hand top side is the 4 color charts, which show blue in architecture, green is the virtual, yellow is the object, and the red is the educational aspects. And next to it is a timeline of projects which we were involved in at the time. And it was a clear distinction to us that we were very much participating at the beginning through architecture, but then started getting involved in the other fields. And the real possibility there was to start to think about how do these things converge? What is then research? What is then part of our learning? And how can we bring any of these new ideas forward to a critical discourse in future practice? So we divided the projects into the next segment, which is the 3rd box from the left, which then shows the key aspects of the practice which we considered were beneficial and had some kind of an extended time and continuous interest through our practice, which we can see still today. And the way this started disseminating was to start to think of this as clusters. So we started to think as a tool of navigating to a system to enable us to understand this research as a series of areas of making, thinking, producing, but also to see how the 4 different aspects of the practice started to impact upon one another. And you can see through the colors that we started assigning values, and these values were in a way beneficial to us to understand the nature of the practice and the value assigned to each project, but also to understand how these values could start to produce meaningful ways to us developing new type of knowledge, and how could this be called then research, a research practice. And on the bottom then we created a torus, and a torus for us was a very important thing of thinking as one of the key structures, where we consider that a torus is essentially an object with no memory, and by assigning value to the object through asymmetry, you can start to see value emerge, which is very much like a DNA composition and the way biological systems actually operate. So in this very cellular way, enabled us to understand how these projects started to behaving in ways to start impacting upon one another. And that gave us an insight that the practice was not a linear process, but a very dynamic process of thinking. And here we see that one of the things that I discovered along the way of the PhD in research was that it was very people-centric. It was really dependent on conversations. It was very dependent upon the type of activities that these conversations evolved in, which impacted heavily upon the discourse of the work. It was also about the collaboration, the people we engaged with in practice, the collaborators both in the office and as consultants, but also outside as adjunct conversations. But then also the influences, and the influences I talk about as historical figures, information that comes from history by having a kind of an approach, traversing back into time and thinking what is the work subjected to? What is the main influencing, what are the main categories of thinking, both theoretical and practical, that might have impacted upon your work? So in this way, we were actually trying to break down each project into a series of clusters, and these clusters became for us a method to understanding how each project was given a differentiating factor of comprehension as a research outcome. And I think this is a very interesting way of thinking about a practice, not just being a single practice, but assigning each object in a practice a series of values so they can assign an understanding of values about that particular way of working. And you can see here that this torus, which here is shown in one iteration, started to evolve, and we anticipated this is a tool that you can actually start to use as a way of querying, inquiring about your work. So the idea of research as an inquiring scenario becomes very interesting, how this actually starts to impact upon the practice in the future. And you can see on the bottom that we are starting to think about understanding in real time inputs from all these different outcomes that influence the work, and to start to think about how they can start to become relevant as solutions to understanding of research practice, and how different projects and different types of practice start to impact on one another. So I'm going to be very brief today, and I will probably open up this to a discourse, but I want to finish off by saying that this fascination, I guess, this idea about collaboration, sharing and information is not something that is was something that was kind of new. It was also something that was beginning very much while I was still a student at RMIT. The development of the school architecture magazine, the notion of exhibitions, which I was heavily involved with, sort of led forward to conversations which in a very kind of, I would say, intuitive way, I wasn't thinking about at the time. But I guess in hindsight, I look back and I think about, well, the Malaysian Biennial, which involves over 500 students, 45 practitioners. And then at the end, when you think about the third image across, which is the tool, which in 2012, when we held this in the Venice Biennale, produced over 2.1 million conversations and 2.4 million file exchanges between students. So in a pedagogical way, this is sort of opening up, I suppose, another way of thinking about research as a way of sharing, collaborating, and bringing new knowledge in a very much more immediate way. And on the last image is a workshop project, which is with Alessi, which we do with Alberto Alessi every year. And this is in its 6th iteration. And it's a very interesting way how you take the idea of object making, the idea of historical thinking about form, and start to mesh that with new technological possibilities, and to start to think about how students can start to elaborate. So this idea of sharing and conversations and building these layers of information will vary and still are very instrumental in our practice right now. So he has gone very much from one of objects, architecture, and it's now starting to seep more into the educational and to the virtual, where we start to look at the tools and the possibilities of this new practice. And I suppose 20 years ago, I had no idea what this practice could be. And we possibly don't even know what practice is going to be in 10 years. But I think that practice is shifting, and we're very much interested in how these dialogues, these transitions, leads to new areas of knowledge for research. Thank you.